There is a brown bottle sitting in your medicine cabinet right now, and there is an almost perfect chance you have forgotten it is there. You bought it months ago, maybe longer. $1.50 at the pharmacy, maybe $2 on a bad day. And you grabbed it because you had a cut on your hand or a scrape on your knee, and you needed something to clean it out. And then the cut healed, and the bottle stayed. And it has been sitting on that shelf collecting dust while you have been driving to the garden center and spending $15, $20, sometimes $30 a bottle on treatments that are not solving your problems. What I am about to tell you is going to make you angry. Not at me, at the system that kept this from you for so long. That brown bottle you ignored is one of the most effective, most versatile, and most aggressively suppressed gardening tools that exist on the face of this earth. And the people profiting from your not knowing about it have been counting on your ignorance for decades. I have been growing plants for 25 years. I have grown tomatoes in Georgia heat that would make a lesser gardener quit by July. I have grown roses in the Pacific Northwest where the gray sky and wet air turn every petal into a fungal battleground by August. I have grown herbs on apartment balconies in climates that were never supposed to support them. And I have grown fruit trees in soil so compacted and depleted that the county extension office told me straight to my face I was wasting my time. And in 25 years of doing this, the single most consistent, most reliable, most cost-effective tool I have ever used in any garden, in any climate, in any application, costs less than a cup of coffee at a gas station. The gardening industry does not want you sitting with that sentence for too long, so let me make it worse. The fungicide market in the United States alone is worth billions of dollars annually. The insecticide market adds billions more. The specialty soil amendment market, the root stimulator market, the seed treatment market. Every one of those categories generates revenue that depends entirely on you not knowing what I am about to tell you. The companies manufacturing those products employ lobbyists, run advertisements in every major gardening publication in America, and sponsor the YouTube channels and Instagram accounts you follow for gardening advice. They do not sponsor this one. That is not an accident. What we cover here costs them money, and today is going to cost them a great deal of it. Hydrogen peroxide. That is the whole secret. The thing in the brown bottle with the child-proof cap that you associate with stinging cuts and fizzing foam is, in a gardening context, a broad-spectrum fungicide, a bactericide, a soil oxygenator, a root stimulator, a seed treatment, a pest deterrent, equipment sanitizer, and a growing medium sterilizer. Every single one of those functions. One product, $1.50 at any drugstore in America. And before I walk you through every single application in detail, I want you to understand the chemistry behind it, because once you understand why it works, you will never be fooled by an overpriced alternative again. When you buy standard drugstore hydrogen peroxide, the label reads 3%. That means the bottle contains 3% hydrogen peroxide and 97% water. The chemical formula for hydrogen peroxide is H2O2. 2 hydrogen atoms, 2 oxygen atoms. Regular water is H2O. The only structural difference between the two molecules is one additional oxygen atom. That single atom is everything. When hydrogen peroxide contacts organic material, the cell wall of a fungal pathogen, the exoskeleton of a soft-bodied pest larva, the membrane of a harmful anaerobic bacterium living in waterlogged soil, it releases that extra oxygen atom in what chemists call an oxidation reaction. The oxygen atom does not negotiate. It does not partially damage the pathogen and leave it weakened. It ruptures the cellular integrity of the target organism on contact. And it does so faster than any synthetic fungicide on the shelf at your garden center. And then, because this is the part that makes the chemical industry genuinely uncomfortable, the hydrogen peroxide molecule breaks down completely. It does not linger. It does not accumulate in your soil. It does not build up in the tissue of your vegetables or leave a residue on your fruit. It does not require a pre-harvest interval or a safety waiting period before you can touch your crops. It breaks down into water and oxygen, 2 things your garden already needs. Nothing left behind. No chemical ghost in the soil. No toxic runoff into your lawn or your groundwater. Just water and air. That is the foundation of every single application I am going to walk you through today. And I want you to hold that chemistry in your mind as we go, because it explains why hydrogen peroxide can do things that a $30 bottle of synthetic fungicide cannot. Now let us talk about the first and most important application. Because if you have been gardening for more than one season, there is a meaningful chance this problem has already killed at least one of your plants and you blamed yourself for it, or blamed the weather, or blamed bad luck, when the real cause was something happening underground that you had no idea how to diagnose. Root rot, the invisible killer. The garden problem that is almost never identified until the damage is catastrophic, and the one that the garden center will happily sell you 3 different products to treat when $1.50 worth of the right solution would have prevented the entire situation in the first place. Here is how root rot actually works, because most of what gets passed around in casual gardening circles is either incomplete or wrong. Root rot is not simply caused by too much water. It is caused by what happens to the soil environment when water stays too long. When your soil becomes and remains saturated, the oxygen that normally occupies the spaces between soil particles gets displaced. The pore spaces fill with water, the oxygen leaves, and the microbial environment of the soil shifts dramatically. Anaerobic conditions, conditions without oxygen, are where specific fungal pathogens thrive. The primary culprits are Phytophthora, Pythium, and Fusarium. These are organisms that cannot survive in a well-oxygenated environment, but become devastatingly aggressive in a low-oxygen, waterlogged one. They attack the root system at its most vulnerable point, destroying the cells that the plant uses to absorb water and nutrients from the soil. The cruelest thing about root rot is its symptoms. A plant with severe root rot will wilt dramatically and look exactly like a plant that desperately needs water. The leaves droop, the stems go limp, the whole plant looks like it is dying of thirst. And so the gardener, seeing a wilting plant, does the natural thing. They water it. They add more water to a soil that is already saturated with it, and they accelerate the very process that is killing the plant. This cycle repeats until the root system collapses entirely and the plant dies. And the gardener writes it off as a mystery or blames the heat or decides they just are not cut out for growing that particular species. Hydrogen peroxide interrupts this cycle at a biochemical level in a way that nothing else in your gardening toolkit can match. When you drench the soil with a properly diluted hydrogen peroxide solution, 2 things happen simultaneously, and both of them are exactly what a plant in this condition needs. First, the free oxygen released by the oxidation reaction destroys the anaerobic pathogens on contact. Phytophthora, Pythium, Fusarium. These organisms cannot survive in an oxygen-rich environment, and the oxygen burst from the hydrogen peroxide is lethal to them at a cellular level. Second, the soil itself gets re-aerated. The oxygen released into the root zone pushes the anaerobic conditions out and restores the kind of well-oxygenated soil environment in which roots function and recover. Most gardeners see visible improvement within 3 to 5 days of a correctly applied drench treatment. Not weeks, days. For a routine maintenance drench, the kind you would apply proactively to containers that have been sitting in wet conditions or to raised beds with soil that has started to compact, the ratio is 4 tablespoons of standard 3% hydrogen peroxide per 1 liter of water. Apply it to soil that has had a chance to dry slightly on the surface, and then let the soil dry out completely before the next watering. For a more aggressive treatment targeting an active root rot situation, I will walk you through the full rescue protocol in detail later in this video, because it involves more than just a drench, and it is worth covering properly rather than rushing through it. The second major application is one that will feel deeply familiar to anyone who has grown squash, roses, or tomatoes in America's humid eastern climate, and that is the treatment and prevention of fungal and bacterial disease above the soil line. Powdery mildew, rust, early blight, late blight, downy mildew, black spot on roses. Every one of these diseases has a dedicated product line at your garden center, and those products are engineered to do one thing extremely well, which is to bring you back to the store in 10 days to buy more of them. The mechanism of a hydrogen peroxide foliar spray against fungal disease is exactly the same as its mechanism in the soil. These pathogens are living organisms. Powdery mildew is a fungal colony establishing itself on the surface of your leaf tissue. Rust is a living pathogen that reproduces through spores it releases into the air. When the oxidizing action of a diluted hydrogen peroxide solution contacts those organisms directly, it destroys their cellular structure on contact, not weakens, destroys. And because the solution breaks down into water and oxygen, it leaves no chemical residue on the leaf surface or in the plant tissue. For prevention, before disease has established, the maintenance spray ratio is half a cup of 3% hydrogen peroxide per 1 gallon of water. This is mild enough for regular use on most established plants and creates a leaf surface environment that is hostile to fungal spore germination. For an active outbreak that has already taken hold, white powder visible on the leaves, rust pustules forming, blight lesions spreading, you move to the treatment concentration, which is 8 to 12 tablespoons of 3% hydrogen peroxide per gallon of water. Spray for 3 consecutive days, making absolutely certain to cover the undersides of leaves, the stems, and the growing points of the plant. Fungal spores colonize the undersides of leaves specifically because that surface is sheltered from UV light and environmental stress. If you spray only the tops of the leaves, you are treating the symptom you can see and missing the pathogen where it is actually living and reproducing. After the 3-day treatment protocol, skip 1 day and then apply a different preventative, a baking soda solution, diluted neem oil, or a sulfur-based spray to suppress regrowth. This rotation approach is what actually stops a fungal outbreak from cycling back. No single treatment, applied repeatedly, is as effective as rotating between mechanisms of action, because pathogens can adapt to selective pressure, but they cannot simultaneously adapt to multiple different attack vectors. The third major application is one that catches people off guard when they first hear it, and it is one of the ones that makes the most immediate visual sense once you understand the biology involved. Fungus gnats. Those tiny, slow-moving black flies that hover around the soil of your containers like they own the place. They seem like a nuisance. They are not merely a nuisance. The adult flies are, in fairness, mostly cosmetic, annoying to look at, harmless in terms of direct plant damage. The larvae are an entirely different story. Fungus gnat larvae live in the top 2 to 3 inches of moist potting soil, and they feed on 2 things: organic matter in the soil and plant roots. In a mature plant with an established root system, a moderate larval infestation is irritating but manageable. In a container with a seedling, a recently rooted cutting, or a newly transplanted specimen, a fungus gnat infestation can be catastrophic. The larvae shred the fine root hairs that young plants depend on for water and nutrient uptake, and the resulting symptoms, wilting, yellowing, failure to thrive, sudden collapse, look identical to root rot. Countless gardeners have thrown away healthy plants that were simply being eaten alive underground by larvae they never thought to look for. Sticky yellow traps catch adult fungus gnats efficiently. They do absolutely nothing about the larvae. The larvae are the problem. The larvae are what hydrogen peroxide addresses directly and brutally. When you drench soil with a 1:4 ratio solution of 3% hydrogen peroxide to water, after allowing the top inch of soil to dry out first, which causes the larvae to move upward toward the surface where they are most vulnerable, the oxygen burst from the oxidation reaction kills the larvae on contact. You will see fizzing at the soil surface during the drench, and that fizzing is the reaction working. Apply this drench every 5 to 7 days for 2 to 3 consecutive weeks. Continue using sticky traps to reduce the adult population, and the infestation collapses because the adults have nowhere to lay viable eggs, and the larvae already in the soil are being eliminated. For soft-bodied insects above the soil line, aphids, spider mites, whitefly, a foliar spray at the preventative concentration of half a cup of 3% peroxide per gallon creates conditions on the leaf surface that these insects find genuinely hostile. Aphids and spider mites have soft, unprotected exoskeletons, and direct contact with even a dilute hydrogen peroxide solution is caustic to that tissue. I am not going to tell you that a hydrogen peroxide foliar spray hits as immediately hard as insecticidal soap on a direct contact basis. It does not. But as a preventative measure applied on a regular rotation, it creates a leaf surface environment that aphid colonies do not want to establish on, and it disrupts the microclimate that spider mites depend on to reproduce rapidly in hot, dry conditions. The fourth application is one that connects hydrogen peroxide to something that happens in nature far above your garden, in the atmosphere during a thunderstorm, and it is one of the most genuinely surprising facts in all of practical horticulture. Have you ever noticed that your plants seem to respond to a hard summer rainstorm in a way that your hose cannot replicate? Not a gentle irrigation, but a real downpour with lightning activity. Within 24 hours of a good storm, plants often look dramatically more vigorous, deeper green, firmer stems, more upright posture, and most gardeners attribute that entirely to the water. The water is part of it, but it is not the whole story. Lightning activity during thunderstorms produces ozone and hydrogen peroxide in the atmosphere. The electrical discharge from lightning converts atmospheric oxygen into ozone, and ozone reacts with water vapor to produce trace amounts of hydrogen peroxide. That hydrogen peroxide falls with the rain. Rainwater collected during and after a thunderstorm contains measurably higher concentrations of dissolved oxygen and trace hydrogen peroxide than tap water or even well water. Plants evolved over hundreds of millions of years in an environment where this periodic peroxide-enhanced rainfall was a regular occurrence. The burst of vigor you see after a storm is partially about the water volume and partially about the oxygenation of the root zone that the storm delivers along with it. When you add hydrogen peroxide to your regular watering routine at the maintenance concentration of 4 tablespoons per liter, you are replicating what a good thunderstorm does for your garden. The oxygen released into the root zone stimulates root cell metabolism. Roots in an oxygen-rich environment are more metabolically active, more efficient at pulling in water and nutrients, and more resilient against the opportunistic pathogens that wait for moments of plant stress to establish. This is especially significant in container gardening, where soil compaction over multiple seasons inevitably reduces the pore space that carries oxygen to the root zone, and in raised beds built with heavy clay-amended soil that compacts readily under repeated watering. The fifth application is one that most gardeners have never considered, because it addresses a problem that happens before the plant even exists in your garden. Seed germination failure. You follow the instructions on the packet, you maintain the right soil temperature, you plant at the correct depth, you keep the moisture consistent. 2 weeks pass, nothing emerges. 3 weeks, still nothing. You dig carefully into the germination tray and find the seeds still there, swollen with absorbed moisture but not cracked, not sprouting, sitting in the soil like it has simply decided not to cooperate. This happens with old seeds, with seeds from certain notoriously difficult varieties, and with commercially packaged seeds that were stored imperfectly. But it also happens with perfectly viable seeds for a reason that almost nobody talks about. Seeds harvested and packaged commercially can carry surface contamination, bacteria, mold spores, and other microorganisms on the seed coat that were present at the point of harvest or developed during storage. In the warm, moist environment of a germination tray, those organisms can outcompete the emerging embryo before the seedling ever manages to push through the seed coat. The embryo is trying to germinate while simultaneously being colonized by pathogens on its own surface. Pre-soaking seeds in a diluted hydrogen peroxide solution before planting addresses this directly. The oxidation reaction sterilizes the seed coat surface, eliminating the bacterial and fungal contamination without penetrating deep enough to damage the viable embryo inside. The embryo is protected within its seed coat. The pathogens on the surface are not. Beyond sterilization, the peroxide soak has a second mechanical benefit that improves germination independently of the disease issue. Seeds have a hard outer coat that evolved to protect the embryo during the dormancy period. In nature, that coat breaks down through repeated freeze-thaw cycles, exposure to soil moisture, and microbial activity over time, or in some cases, passage through the digestive system of animals. A brief peroxide soak artificially softens and slightly thins the seed coat, allowing moisture to penetrate to the embryo more quickly and allowing the emerging root tip to push through the softened coat with less resistance. Germination speed improves. In side-by-side tests with difficult varieties, old tomato seeds, notoriously slow pepper cultivars, seeds with reputationally tough coats like Morning Glory or Moonflower, pre-soaked seeds consistently emerge days to a full week earlier than untreated seeds from the same packet. The soak ratio is 1 to 1.5 teaspoons of 3% hydrogen peroxide per cup of water. Soak for no more than 30 minutes and plant immediately. Do not allow soaked seeds to dry out before planting. The sixth application is one that experienced gardeners treat as fundamental practice and that beginners almost universally overlook until the moment it cost them something they cared about. Tool sanitation. Your pruning shears are a disease vector. Your grafting knife is a disease vector. The trowel you use to repot containers is a disease vector. Every cutting tool you move from one plant to the next carries biological material from the previous plant. And if that previous plant had any pathogen present, any fungal spore, any bacterial colony, any viral contamination, you delivered it personally to the next plant in line. The Garden Center will sell you specialized tool sanitizers for this purpose. You do not need them. Undiluted 3% hydrogen peroxide, applied directly to the blade with a clean cloth or cotton pad, provides contact-kill sanitization against bacteria, viruses, mold spores, and fungal pathogens in under 30 seconds. Wipe the blade. Wait 30 seconds. Wipe it dry. That is the entire protocol. It takes less time than reading the warning label on a commercial sanitizer, and it costs a fraction of a cent per application. The same principle applies to your pots and containers between seasons. A pot that hosted a plant with root rot last year is not a clean pot. Rinsing it with water and filling it with fresh soil does not address the pathogen load on the inside surface of that pot. Phytophthora and Pythium can survive on container surfaces through winter and establish immediately in the next planting season the moment moisture and organic material are present. The treatment is straightforward. Fill or thoroughly spray the interior of the pot with a solution of 1 part 3% hydrogen peroxide to 1 part water. Let it sit for 10 minutes. Rinse thoroughly. Let the pot dry completely before adding new growing medium. The pathogen load is eliminated. The pot is genuinely clean in a way that a water rinse never achieves. For greenhouse growers, and I know a significant number of you in this community run cold frames, small hobby greenhouses, or attached growing structures, the same logic applies to every surface in that structure. Benches, trays, the glazing material, irrigation lines, propagation trays. Everything that holds moisture and organic material between growing seasons can harbor overwintering pathogens. Before the start of each growing season, a thorough wipe down of all surfaces with a strong hydrogen peroxide solution, 1 part 3% peroxide to 1 part water, applied with a pump sprayer and wiped down with clean cloths, resets the microbial environment of that space. Compare this to the bleach treatments that some growers use for greenhouse sanitation. Bleach is effective. It is also corrosive to metal benching and irrigation fittings, leaves chlorine residue on surfaces that can damage sensitive seedlings and cuttings, and cannot be used anywhere near actively growing plants without significant risk of phytotoxic damage. Hydrogen peroxide leaves nothing behind that you would not want in your garden. The seventh application is one that will save you money immediately and every season after this one if you start doing it now. And it is something the nursery industry actively profits from your not knowing. You can reuse potting soil. Old potting soil that comes out of a container where a plant finished its season, died from disease, or struggled without a clear diagnosis carries a biological load that makes replanting into it risky without treatment. Dormant fungal spores, soil-dwelling pest eggs, harmful nematodes, and established bacterial colonies can all survive in used growing medium through an off-season and resume activity the moment conditions become favorable again. But that growing medium is structurally sound. The perlite is still there. The peat or coco coir is still there. The base nutrition has been depleted by the previous plant, but that is addressable with amendment. What you need to eliminate is the pathogen load, and hydrogen peroxide does that completely. Mix 1 cup of 3% hydrogen peroxide per gallon of water and drench the used growing medium thoroughly, working the solution through the entire volume of soil rather than just soaking the surface. The oxidation reaction penetrates through the medium and destroys the pathogens it contacts throughout. Let the treated soil sit for 24 to 48 hours before planting into it. By that point, the hydrogen peroxide has broken down completely, leaving the soil with elevated oxygen content and no chemical residue. The soil is ready to use. Amended with a balanced, slow-release fertilizer and a quality compost addition to rebuild the microbial community, that reused growing medium will perform as well as a fresh bag from the store. And it costs you nothing beyond a fraction of a bottle of peroxide. The 8th application is one that is growing in relevance as more American gardeners move toward indoor and controlled environment growing: hydroponics and aquaponics. If you have shifted any portion of your growing into a hydroponic setup, nutrient film technique, deep water culture, ebb and flow systems, even simple Kratky containers, you have encountered the fundamental challenge of every hydroponic system: the water environment. Warm, nutrient-dense recirculating water is an ideal medium for growing plants, and it is equally ideal for growing algae, developing biofilm on reservoir walls and tubing, and incubating Pythium, the water mold that causes root rot in hydroponic root systems. Pythium in a hydroponic reservoir spreads far faster than it does in soil because the water carries it directly to every root in the system simultaneously. Hydrogen peroxide in a hydroponic reservoir addresses all 3 of these problems. The oxidizing action prevents algae from colonizing the reservoir walls and root chamber surfaces because algae cannot establish in an environment with active oxidation and elevated dissolved oxygen. The same action inhibits biofilm formation on tubing and reservoir surfaces. And the elevated dissolved oxygen level created by the breakdown of hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen directly benefits the root system in exactly the way that healthy soil oxygenation benefits soil-grown roots. The addition rate for hydroponic systems is approximately 2 to 3 milliliters of 3% hydrogen peroxide per liter of reservoir water, added fresh every 3 to 5 days rather than in large, infrequent doses. Consistency at low concentration is what you want, not periodic high-dose shocks to the system. One critical warning for hydroponic growers using hydrogen peroxide, and I cannot overstate how important this is: never add hydrogen peroxide to a reservoir that also contains a beneficial microbial inoculant. Products containing mycorrhizal fungi, beneficial bacterial strains, or beneficial nematodes are incompatible with hydrogen peroxide application. The oxidizing action of the peroxide does not discriminate between harmful pathogens and beneficial organisms. It will destroy beneficial bacteria and mycorrhizal networks with the same efficiency it applies to Pythium and algae. If you are using microbial products in your hydroponic system, choose one approach or the other. Do not combine them and expect the beneficial organisms to survive. Now I want to walk you through the complete root rot rescue protocol in the detail it deserves, because this is the application that I promised at the beginning of this video, and it is the one that has the highest stakes of everything we have covered. If you have a plant right now that is wilting, yellowing, declining without a clear above-ground cause, dropping leaves, or simply failing to thrive despite correct watering and nutrition, pull it out of its pot and look at the roots before you do anything else. This is the step that most gardeners never take because it feels drastic, and by the time they finally take it, the root damage is so extensive that recovery is not realistic. Do not wait for that point. Take the plant out of its container. Gently shake or rinse the excess soil from the root ball with room temperature water. Not a forceful blast, just enough to get a clear look at what you are working with. Healthy roots are white or cream-colored, firm when you touch them, and smell like clean soil. Diseased roots are brown, gray, or black, soft and mushy when you press them between your fingers, and they produce a sour, swampy, unpleasant odor that is the unmistakable smell of anaerobic bacterial activity. If you find both healthy and diseased roots, which is the most common scenario in a plant that is in early to mid-stage decline, there is a strong chance you can save it. If the entire root system is black, mushy, and foul-smelling, with no firm white roots remaining, the prognosis is poor. Be honest with yourself about what you are looking at. Using pruning shears or scissors that you have wiped down with undiluted hydrogen peroxide, do this before you start cutting, not after. Remove every root that is dark and soft. Cut clean and cut completely. Do not attempt to preserve a partially damaged root because it looks like it might recover. A root that has been compromised by Pythium or Phytophthora is not going to recover, and leaving it attached to the plant means leaving an active infection site that will spread into the remaining healthy root tissue. Be aggressive with the removal. You are not hurting the plant by cutting diseased tissue. You are hurting it by leaving that tissue attached. Once the diseased roots have been removed and you are left with only the firm, white, healthy roots, prepare a treatment bath. Use a clean container, a bucket, a bowl, anything large enough to submerge the root system, and mix 1 part 3% hydrogen peroxide with 2 to 3 parts clean water. Submerge the trimmed root system in this solution and let it soak for 5 to 10 minutes. You will see fizzing around the root zone during the soak, and that reaction is doing exactly what you need it to do. The oxidation is destroying any residual pathogen cells on the surface of the remaining root tissue, and the oxygen released into the root cells is beginning to stimulate recovery of the cellular metabolism that root rot suppresses. After the soak, gently pat the root system dry with a clean, dry cloth. Do not rub, twist, or pull the roots during this step. Damaged root tips that are still healthy need to remain intact. Repot the plant into fresh, well-draining growing medium, not the soil that came out of that container, not soil from a bag you have used before and stored open, and not soil you have not treated. Fresh growing medium. The moment you put those cleaned roots back into contaminated soil, every step of this process becomes irrelevant. The pathogen is still in the old soil, waiting for exactly this opportunity. For the first watering after repotting, use a mild drench at the maintenance concentration. 4 tablespoons of 3% hydrogen peroxide per liter of water, applied directly to the fresh growing medium. This serves 2 functions simultaneously. It disinfects the new soil as an additional layer of protection and gives the recovering roots an immediate oxygen boost in their new environment. After this first application, step back. Do not fertilize the recovering plant for at least 2 to 3 weeks. A root system that has just been through trauma and surgery does not need the metabolic demand of processing a nutrient load. It needs to establish new root tips in the fresh soil and rebuild basic function. Fertilizing too early will stress a system that is not yet capable of using those nutrients efficiently and can cause additional damage. Water the recovering plant only when the container feels genuinely light when you lift it. Weight is your most reliable guide. A container with moist soil is heavy. A container that needs water is noticeably lighter. Visual cues, drooping, dry soil surface, are less reliable indicators for a plant in recovery because root damage compromises the plant's ability to signal water need accurately. Use the weight test every time. Now I want to address the question about trees directly, because trees represent a different category of stakes entirely. A perennial plant that you lose costs you a season. A tree that you lose can cost you a decade of growth, or a permanent landscape feature that took 20 years to establish. Damaged trees. Storm damage, lawnmower wounds, disease entry through pruning cuts made with unsterilized tools are vulnerable at the wound site in ways that soil-grown plants are not. The cambium layer, which is the living tissue between the outer bark and the woody interior, is the tissue that forms the callus to seal a wound. It is also the tissue most vulnerable to opportunistic pathogen invasion immediately after wounding. Fire blight in apple and pear trees is a bacterial disease, Erwinia amylivora, that enters most commonly through blossoms and pruning wounds. Cytospora canker in stone fruits, Nectria canker in a broad range of deciduous trees. These infections frequently begin at wound sites where the wood is exposed and the cambium is accessible. A surface application of 3% hydrogen peroxide applied to a fresh wound with a clean cloth or spray bottle immediately after the wound occurs can reduce the pathogen load at that site during the critical window before callus formation begins. This is not a cure for a systemic tree infection. I will not pretend it is, but as a first response protective measure applied to fresh wounds, it is meaningful. For trees that are showing signs of external fungal colonization, mushroom-like fruiting bodies at the base, powdery patches on the bark surface, canker lesions with fungal growth at the margins, a hydrogen peroxide wash of the affected bark surface with a stronger solution, approximately 1 part 3% peroxide to 2 parts water, applied with a stiff brush to the affected area, can reduce the external fungal load and buy the tree time to mount its own defense response. Monitor the site closely after treatment. If fungal fruiting bodies return, if the canker expands, if bark begins lifting or discoloring in new areas, contact a certified arborist. Surface treatments address surface pathogens. Internal vascular infections in trees require professional assessment and sometimes systemic treatment that goes beyond anything we can apply from the outside. I also want to address the concentration safety issue directly and completely, because this is where gardeners get into trouble, and a mistake with hydrogen peroxide concentration is not a gentle mistake. Standard 3% hydrogen peroxide from any pharmacy or grocery store in America is your working baseline for every application I have described in this video. Every ratio I have given you is calibrated to 3% as the starting concentration. There is a separate product sold in some health food stores and online under the name 35% food-grade hydrogen peroxide. Some gardening enthusiasts advocate for it as a cost-effective concentrate that you dilute down. I want to be unambiguous with you. At 35% concentration, hydrogen peroxide is corrosive. Direct contact with 35% hydrogen peroxide will chemically burn your skin, damage your eyes seriously, and can cause internal injury if ingested. Undiluted on plant roots or leaves, it will destroy tissue immediately and completely. If you choose to work with 35% food-grade peroxide, you must dilute 1 part of the concentrate with 11 parts of distilled water to achieve a 3% equivalent before applying any of the ratios in this video. That dilution step is not optional and it is not negotiable. Skip it and you will chemically burn the roots you were trying to save. If this video gave you something useful, one application you did not know about, one product purchase you are not going to make, one plant you are going to save instead of replace, then take 3 seconds right now and hit the like button. It costs you nothing and it tells the algorithm that this kind of content is worth putting in front of more people who need it. If you are not subscribed yet, subscribe right now. Every week this channel produces content built on the same foundation as this video. Real information, real applications, no sponsorships, no products pushed at you for someone else's financial benefit. And if someone in your life is spending money every spring on garden problems that have cheaper, better solutions, send them this video. Share it. Drop it in a gardening group. Text it to your neighbor who keeps losing tomatoes every August. The information only helps the people who have it, and it costs you nothing to pass it on.